appreciate very much the opportunity to talk about civil disobedience with this group of activists who I have said to many people over many years of being an ally of T1 International and the Insulin for All movement, is really, you all are really the spirit of civil rights and human rights advocacy in this country. You embody it as much or more so than anyone in this country and beyond. And so it's a real honor to have this conversation with you. So this conversation actually about civil disobedience arises in part out of a dramatic event that happened at last year's event when we were blessed to be able to meet live and in person. And that was that Nicole, who you've already heard from, and I think folks here already know, herself was arrested by law enforcement in Indianapolis, protesting in front of the Eli Lilly and Company headquarters. And that was certainly a dramatic event and something that led to some questions and just an opportunity to discuss the bigger picture of civil disobedience. And for me, for a background, just briefly, I have had the privilege of teaching about social movements, including civil disobedience, to law students here where I work at Indiana University McKinney School of Law. I've been a lawyer for persons who've been committed civil disobedience, and I myself have been arrested in civil disobedience myself. So let me go ahead and make a couple of foundational points to begin. And that is, number one is civil disobedience is really dramatic. Civil disobedience can be enormously impactful, but it is just one tool in the advocacy toolbox that Elizabeth referred to. It is a dramatic tool. It is one that people pay a lot of attention to, but it is just one possible way of moving forward a social movement like the Insulin for All movement. And it is oftentimes not the right tool, just to be clear. And it's frankly, in many cases, not the right tool because core activists are not in a position to endure arrest and risk imprisonment. And that, of course, I don't need to tell folks on this workshop, that includes persons with type 1 diabetes because insulin access while in custody can be so problematic. So just wanted to give a little context there. And in the bigger picture context here is the idea of where civil disobedience fits in the course of a social movement. And that is that this is a chart that we share when we teach about social movements in the classroom, and it comes from a famous mapping of the process of a successful social movement by an activist and a scholar named Bill Moyer, M-O-Y-E-R, not Bill Moyers, the video journalist, but Bill Moyer without an S on it. And you see there's 8 stages in his calculation, which a lot of folks subscribe to, of social movement success. And a lot of this is going to look really familiar to all of you because proving the failure of official institutions and ripening conditions you see there in 2 and 3 and 6 majority public opinion. It is really reflecting the time that you already spend, that grind, that slow month-to-month, year-to-year grind of researching the issues, of advocating to lawmakers and advocating to the public and reaching out via media and social media, et cetera, to raise awareness about the challenge of in this case, access to insulin for all. That's where real social movement success happens. But stage 4, which I've highlighted here on the screen, that's the dramatic time. That's the time where people get in the streets. That's the time where headlines are made. That's the time where the media pays attention. And oftentimes that is where civil disobedience occurs. And civil disobedience, again, can be incredibly dramatic, can be really exciting, but it's usually not where the movement is won. It's usually just, again, this is only halfway through the process, and oftentimes is followed by a kind of a down period. We're like, oh, why isn't the media covering us as much anymore? Where are the TV cameras? Where's this dramatic event? But it gets back to this grind that you all do so wonderfully every day in research and advocacy. So I just want to put it again in context about where civil disobedience fits in a social movement. And let me just take a half step back and say, I have 20 minutes in the schedule, which is wonderful that we're moving things quickly. Hopefully I will stop my yapping with enough time to do a little bit of Q&A if we get done in time. but also happy to respond to questions, and I can make sure that my email address, let me just go ahead and say it orally, fwquigley, Quigley @gmail.com. Happy to respond to questions and share any of this information afterwards as well. So in terms of civil disobedience in the United States, the history dates back, at least in use of the term, to Henry David Thoreau, you may have heard of, on Walden Pond, etc. Henry David Thoreau in the mid-19th century went to jail committing civil disobedience and ended up writing an essay about it on civil disobedience. His civil disobedience was he would refuse to pay his taxes because the taxes were going to support both slavery and the Mexican-American War, which he objected to. That's pretty common, is a pretty common form of civil disobedience, is refusing to cooperate with the government by refusing to pay taxes to support unjust, immoral actions. Depending on how you define civil disobedience, if you say it can't include even violence to property, the Boston Tea Party could be considered one of the first American acts of civil disobedience. Again, incredibly profound, influential actions. One of the fundamental precepts of civil disobedience is that the foundation of it is that there are a lot of enormously unjust and immoral practices now and in the past that are completely legal. Slavery was legal. Segregation was legal. Jim Crow laws were legal. Blocking women from the vote was completely legal. Even the Holocaust was legal. And that's, of course, not just ancient history. There are a lot of things today that are completely unjust and immoral, and most of us would think is a violation of human rights, such as charging hundreds of dollars a vial for insulin that can be manufactured for a few dollars when it is essential to folks' lives. That's legal. It's not moral. It's a violation of human rights, and civil disobedience often lifts up and highlights the disconnect between the morality and the true on the books legality that needs to be changed. And one of the most impactful and profound examples of civil disobedience in the United States history was the resistance to slavery. Again, it was fully legal. And the resistance included legal forms of protest, like petitions and rallies and lobbying lawmakers, etc. But it also included, really impactfully, some illegal acts, a lot of illegal acts, like actually helping persons who were enslaved to freedom. The Underground Railroad and folks like Harriet Tubman, I mean, they broke the law. They broke the law and committed civil disobedience in order to not just address the injustice of those individuals they were trying to help escape, but also to highlight the broader injustice of slavery, which was in fact legalized at that time. There are parallels to what this movement is doing now. Folks are, I'm sure, aware of the bus tours last summer, where folks from T1 International and the Insulin for All movement actually went over the border, went to Canada, purchased the massively cheaper insulin, the same insulin, and brought it back to the United States. That was illegal. That was technically illegal. It is something that fortunately is a law that's not widely enforced, but the folks doing that were very aware that they were breaking the law. And by breaking the law, that added drama to what they were doing. It did get a lot of media attention. It did get a lot of public attention. Less of a media event is what, again, a lot of folks in this community already do, and that is to share insulin with folks who are in crisis, who need it. Again, that is not something that is technically legally allowed, but it's not something that is a law that's widely enforced. But the folks doing that, everybody I know who does it knows that they're taking some kind of risk, but they're willing to take the risk, and willing to take the risk partly because it's the right thing to do for the person they're helping, but also because it highlights the injustice of why should we have people in our communities who can't afford their insulin, who can't get access to what is necessary for their life. So let me go ahead and make the next. Yeah, civil disobedience is not, of course, a uniquely American phenomenon. I'm speaking from the U.S., and that's where I do my teaching. So that's a lot of what I'm most aware of. But the civil rights movement, which we'll talk about in a minute, is the United States' really signature civil disobedience social movement. But the impetus for it and the structure, especially the nonviolent aspect of the civil rights movement, came from Mahatma Gandhi and from the very successful resistance to colonialism in India and beyond. For example, in the Salt March, Gandhi marched to the sea and it very symbolically manufactured or made a little bit of salt. Well, that was symbolism, but it was also very tangible in that the people of India needed salt. It was being monopolized and priced at an enormous level by colonizers and by profiteers, and his actions broke the law. His actions led to him eventually being arrested and imprisoned but it absolutely, for the world and for his community, highlighted the injustice of what was technically legal and changed the law, changed the society. The civil rights movement, folks are aware of the massive amount of civil disobedience that occurred in the civil rights movement. But what a lot of folks don't know is that what was conducted and coordinated by the leaders of the civil rights movement were sometimes not the most impactful forms of civil disobedience. The lunch counters being segregated in places like Greensboro, South Carolina, and in Nashville, Tennessee, that was done by young people, by college students, and it was done almost in a spontaneous way. And they obviously were incredibly brave. They endured abuse, they endured beatings, they endured arrest. But in so doing, throughout the civil rights movement, those arrests, those imprisonments lifted up the unjust nature of segregation laws and discrimination, legalized discrimination across the United States. Dr. King's maybe most impactful writing of all time, not coincidentally, was his letter from a Birmingham jail where he had been arrested for civil disobedience. He wrote the letter in the margins of a newspaper and smuggled out by his visiting lawyers. And the fact that he was so willing to endure this personal sacrifice gave enormous resonance to his message and to the entire movement. And the movement succeeded in significant part because the voluntary suffering and the civil disobedience being committed by the activists led to the moral question, the moral tragedy of racism being lifted up and forcing lawmakers to act. And the movement, I think that's really important for us to remember, and was highlighted in last year's workshop by Greg Gonzalez being the keynote speaker. Greg was a member of ACT UP, and the ACT UP movement, which was pushing for access to HIV/AIDS medicines, has enormous resonance and enormous parallels to the Insulin for All movement and T1 International, of course, because it was a patient-led movement, because it was focused on access to medicines, that without that medicines, people would suffer and people would die. And there is terrific resources out there. Fortunately, the folks who were activists in that movement, many of whom are still with us, like Greg, there is a terrific book and film out there called How to Survive a Plague about this movement. And this quote here that I have on the screen is from one of those activists saying that, again, who's living a healthy life today, if I didn't get arrested then, I wouldn't be alive today. So that movement, civil disobedience, was a core component of it. Again, lifted up the injustice that was being perpetrated on persons who needed medicines to survive, while corporations and folks were profiteering from those very same medicines. So the time I want to be sensitive to, that we're about running out. Let me just conclude by saying this. The book on civil disobedience, of course, is continuing to be written. It's a part of the Black Lives Movement. It's a part of the environmental movement. It's a part of the access to healthcare movement. And it is for folks who are leaders of the access to insulin movement and T1 International and all of you in your individual chapters to decide whether civil disobedience is one of the tools in your toolbox. But just know that again, it's one particular prospect for social movements. It can be enormously impactful if it is chosen at the right time, and persons, of course, can continue to keep themselves safe in the process. Okay, well, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you. I think
the first question that we've got is just more about how civil disobedience acts are planned, or civil disobedience actions are planned, and they don't just arise spontaneously or randomly, as you said. So can you talk a little bit about what goes into the planning process?
Sure, that varies. It's a great question. It varies, and just to lift up the curtain a little bit on what happened last year. For an example, when Nicole was arrested, the police in Indianapolis knew she was going to commit this act of civil disobedience. And I will say that as an attorney here in Indianapolis, I did help coordinate those discussions. Oftentimes, civil disobedience is very planned. It is almost always a good idea if you want to preserve the safety of the persons who are committing the act to coordinate with law enforcement in advance. That's not always the case. And sometimes activists don't want to do that. Sometimes they are willing to, and the danger and frankly the possible chaos of arrests and illegal acts committed when law enforcement is not advised in advance is something that activists want to do. That's dangerous. It's dangerous. And again, I know folks who have done that who have done unplanned civil disobedience, and they spend a long time in jail sometimes. And if they have conditions where they need to get access to medicines and care, that's literally life risking. So as a lawyer, I will say that that's not the way that I would prefer to have it happen. I think folks in law enforcement would say that as well. But sometimes that's the way these things occur, and they definitely do raise up the drama. And sometimes getting drama is part of the goal of civil disobedience action.
Got it. Thank you. Our next question is if you were able to speak at all to the specific legalities around mailing insulin across borders. So, for example, from Canada to the United States.
Yeah, I'm a little hesitant to speak with great expertise on it, but I think that two safe statements to make is that technically this is technically at least questionable legality is point number one. Point number two is that I have never known of or heard of or have any reason to believe that anyone has ever faced arrest or criminal charges for doing so. I think those are the 2 points I would make.
Got it. Thank you. If you can speak more about diabetes care in police custody or any resources available to help people with diabetes make the calculation of whether or how to engage in civil disobedience safely. She says that she wasn't really able to find any tips or discussion about protesting with diabetes or other chronic conditions during the protests, the Black Lives Matter protests earlier this summer. Yeah,
I will say this is that the fact that Nicole committed her act of civil disobedience here in Indianapolis, and I happen to be a lawyer who's practiced law in this town a long time, was a real advantage because law enforcement is a very local activity. And so, and I think, to be honest, I really think that it's not advisable for persons who are insulin dependent to be risking arrest in almost any setting. But if that's the case, I would strongly advise reaching out to law enforcement in advance. Say, we're going to do this. We're going to need access to insulin. Can I keep it on me? Which probably the answer is going to be no. Can I make sure I have access to it? But even with their assurances, that is no guarantee. But it is civil disobedience is, in my mind, if you want to be safe, which I think is got to be paramount, has to be at least somewhat in coordination with law enforcement. Doesn't mean you're not going to get arrested. Doesn't mean you're not going to face criminal charges. Doesn't mean it's risk-free. But that's the way that it is most often done.
Thanks. And then our final question is going to be, she herself is a law student, and one of her professors has been writing about the idea that lawyers have a duty to break the law via civil disobedience and other similar actions. And she's asking how you would suggest balancing the desire to engage in civil disobedience with professional responsibility in all professions, not just in law.
Yeah, it's a real question, and I certainly know a lot of folks in our profession, lawyers and law students, who would like to commit civil disobedience and do not. I have. But frankly, I have, as a privileged white male who has a job that is not going to fire me for doing that, and I was willing to deal with the professional responsibility. I have a lot of students who are Black students, law students, who this summer were really in a great deal of emotional pain because they decided they should not go risk arrest because they were worried it was going to be something to prevent them from being admitted to the bar. In my thinking, it shouldn't be, and my thinking there'd be a process for any of us to persuade and to present to our licensing bodies that we shouldn't be sanctioned for committing a just act, even if it's technically illegal. That's easy for me to say. I made my choice from a place of privilege that, frankly, young Black students and even young folks who have not yet been admitted to the bar that's a tough place to play. Let me just say one thing is there's a whole lot that law students and lawyers can do to support civil disobedience actions without being the ones arrested. There's an enormous need for legal observers and for folks to advocate before and after arrest. And oftentimes, we can do our best work without being the ones in handcuffs.